The dusty main street of Redemption Creek stretched out beneath the scorching Texas sun, empty save for a few hitching posts and the occasional tumbleweed dancing in the dry wind. Jake Mitchell dismounted his chestnut mare with the slow deliberation of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. His boots hit the wooden planks of the boardwalk with a hollow thud as he made his way toward the general store, spurs jingling with each step. He'd been riding fence lines for 3 days straight, checking cattle and repairing breaks in the wire that kept his herd contained. The work was endless on a ranch, but it was honest work, and Jake had always prided himself on being an honest man. His father had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he did when people were watching, but by what he did when no one would ever know. As he reached for the door handle of Morrison's general store, he heard voices inside, one pleading, one firm and unyielding. Jake paused, his hand hovering over the brass handle. It wasn't his habit to eavesdrop, but something in the desperation of that first voice made him hesitate. "Please, Mr. Morrison. It's real gold. My grandmother's ring. It must be worth something." The woman's voice cracked slightly, fighting to maintain composure. "Mrs. Palmer, I've told you 3 times now. I'm not a pawnbroker. I sell goods, I don't buy jewelry. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't give you what it's worth. You'd be better off going to the bank." "I tried the bank. They said it would take 3 days to assess the value. I don't have 3 days. My children haven't had a proper meal in 2 days and I—" Her voice broke entirely now, dissolving into a barely suppressed sob. Jake pushed open the door, the bell above announcing his entrance. The scene before him confirmed what his ears had already told him. A young woman stood at the counter, her back rigid with the effort of maintaining her dignity. Her dress, though clean and carefully mended, had seen better days. The fabric hung loosely on her frame, suggesting weight recently lost. One hand rested protectively over her swollen belly while the other clutched a small golden ring, holding it out toward the shopkeeper like a talisman that had lost its power. Arthur Morrison, a portly man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, looked equal parts uncomfortable and resolute. He'd run his store for 20 years and had learned the hard way that sympathy didn't pay the bills. When he saw Jake enter, relief washed over his features at the interruption. "Afternoon, Jake. Be with you in just a moment." The woman turned at the sound of her name, and Jake got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, probably no more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, held a terrible mixture of hope and shame. Those eyes darted to Jake for just a moment before dropping to the floor, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at being witnessed in such a vulnerable state. Jake recognized her then, though they'd never been formally introduced. Sarah Palmer. Her husband, Thomas Palmer, had worked as a ranch hand for the Hendersons spread about 15 miles out. Jake had seen them in town a few times, always thought they made a handsome couple. Thomas had been killed 4 months ago when his horse spooked during a storm and threw him against a fence post. The whole town had talked about it for weeks. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said quietly, her fingers closing around the ring. I'll figure something else out." She moved toward the door, her gait slightly unsteady, and Jake noticed how pale she was beneath the sunburn on her cheeks. This wasn't just hunger and grief. This was a woman approaching the limits of her endurance. "Hold on a minute, ma'am," Jake said, his voice gentle. He turned to Morrison. "Arthur, why don't you set aside whatever Mrs. Palmer was hoping to purchase? I'll settle up for both of us." "No," Sarah said immediately, her pride flaring bright and fierce. "I couldn't possibly accept charity from a stranger, Mr. Mitchell. Jake Mitchell. And it's not charity, Mrs. Palmer. Let's call it neighborly assistance. The kind that goes around and comes around in these parts. I don't need anyone's pity," she said, but her voice wavered, betraying the desperation beneath the words. Jake studied her for a moment, seeing past the pride to the terror underneath. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of cornered animals and desperate people. It was the look of someone who'd run out of options and was staring into an abyss. "Tell you what," he said, removing his hat and turning it over in his hands. "I've got a problem that maybe you could help me with. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chin, she's getting on in years. Been asking me to find someone who could help her out a few days a week. Light work, cooking, some cleaning, tending the kitchen garden. I don't suppose you'd be interested in that kind of arrangement. Pays fair, and there's a small cottage on the property that's sitting empty." It was a lie, of course. Mrs. Chin was as spry as ever and ran Jake's household with an iron efficiency that required no assistance. But it was the kind of lie that let a person accept help without feeling like they were taking a handout. Sarah's eyes searched his face, looking for mockery or ulterior motives. Jake kept his expression open and honest, letting her see that whatever his reasons, they weren't meant to harm or humiliate her. "I have 2 children," she said carefully. "A boy of 5 and a girl of 3. Cottage has 2 bedrooms. Mrs. Chin loves children. Had 6 of her own before they all grew up and moved to California. Sarah's hand moved to her belly again. "I'm expecting. In about 3 months. Can't see how that would be a problem. Mrs. Chin delivered half the babies in this county back in her day. She'd probably be insulted if you tried to bring in anyone else when your time came." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the tears of desperation she'd been fighting before. These were tears of relief so profound it almost hurt to witness. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly, and Jake stepped forward instinctively, catching her elbow to steady her. "Easy now, ma'am. When's the last time you ate? I gave the children the last of the beans yesterday morning. There's been nothing since." Jake's jaw tightened with anger, not at Sarah, but at a world that could let a pregnant widow and her children go hungry while men like him had more than they needed. He turned to Morrison. "Arthur, pack up flour, sugar, beans, rice, salt pork, coffee, canned milk, eggs, bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables you've got that are fresh. Add in some candy for the children. And some of that beef jerky that just came in." "Jake, that's too much," Sarah began. "Working man's wages start today," Jake said firmly. "Consider this in advance. Besides, you'll be doing me a favor. Mrs. Chen's been after me for months about needing help, and I've been too stubborn to admit she was right. You know how women are when they get proven right about something. I'll never hear the end of it." A small, tentative smile crossed Sarah's face, the first genuine expression of anything other than despair he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, hinting at the woman she might have been before grief and hardship had taken their toll. Morrison began pulling items from the shelves, piling them on the counter. As he worked, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather purse. It contained most of his month's profits from selling a string of horses to the army, nearly $80, more money than he usually carried. He'd been planning to deposit it at the bank after making his purchases, but looking at Sarah Palmer's exhausted face and trembling hands, he knew there was a better use for it. "Here," he said, pressing the entire purse into her hands before she could object. "First month's wages, plus a bit extra to help you get settled. The cottage needs some supplies, curtains, linens, that sort of thing. You'll need to pick those up." Sarah stared at the purse in her hands as if it were a snake that might bite her. "This is too much. This has to be more than a month's wages for the kind of work you're describing. Are you questioning how I run my business, Mrs. Palmer?" Jake asked with mock sternness. "Because that's not a promising start to our working relationship." Despite everything, Sarah laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle her as much as it did Jake. "You're either the kindest man in Texas or the worst liar I've ever met. Can it be both?" She looked down at the purse again, then back up at Jake. Her pride was still there, visible in the set of her shoulders and the lift of her chin, but it had been joined by something else. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of tentative hope that was almost painful to see. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me. You don't know me anything." Jake was silent for a moment, remembering his own mother. She'd been widowed young too, left with 3 boys to raise and a failing farm. It had been the kindness of neighbors, some expected, some completely unexpected, that had seen them through. Old Mr. Harrigan bringing by a side of beef with some story about needing to clear out his smokehouse. Mrs. Walsh showing up with fabric remnants she claimed she couldn't use, enough to make clothes for 3 growing boys. The schoolteacher who never sent home notices about unpaid fees. My mama used to say that we're all just walking each other home, Jake said finally. Sometimes the path is smooth, and sometimes it's rocky as hell. When you see someone stumbling on the rocky parts, you give them a hand. That's all. Sarah's throat worked as she swallowed hard. I promise I'll work hard. I'll earn every penny. I don't doubt it for a second. Now, why don't you tell Morrison where you're staying, and I'll have these supplies loaded up and delivered this afternoon. That is, if you feel up to riding out to the ranch today to see the cottage? I can bring the wagon around in about an hour. My children are at Mrs. Brennan's. She's been watching them while I tried to. Sarah's voice caught. While I tried to find a solution. We'll pick them up on the way. Mrs. Chin will want to meet everyone, and I suspect she'll insist on cooking dinner for all of us. She gets offended if people aren't properly fed at least once a day. As Morrison finished packing the supplies into crates, Sarah suddenly remembered the ring still clutched in her hand. She looked at it for a long moment, this small golden circle that had represented her grandmother's love, her marriage, and finally her last desperate hope. Keep it, Jake said softly, noticing her gaze. Some things aren't meant to be traded, no matter how hungry we get. Sarah closed her fingers around the ring and nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. Thank you? I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness. You already did by accepting help when you needed it. That takes more courage than most people know. Jake settled his hat back on his head and tipped it to her. Now let's go collect those children of yours. I have a feeling Mrs. Chen's going to spoil them rotten, and I'd like to see their faces when they taste her apple pie. As they walked out into the afternoon sun together, Jake Mitchell felt the weight of his now empty purse and found it didn't bother him at all. Some things, he thought, were worth more than money could ever measure. And the look of hope rekindled in a desperate woman's eyes was chief among them.